Today is Sunday, February 8th, and this video is a continuation of a discussion that began around metaphysics and quantum mechanics. And I will post the short that I created around that discussion at the end of the documentary included in this particular video. Because the documentary is about the development of war-fighting weapons, which can cause fear in people, it also extends this discussion into one about why disrupting communication between people is important. It also helps to add to the commentary a question about why it is people are unwilling to heed a warning before it's too late. So I want to start with a too long didn't read TLDR version of this video with a couple of clips, which I hope will help you to watch the video in its entirety.
And strange domes appeared on MIT rooftops. Inside the mysterious structures, experimental radars showed their stuff by bouncing test signals off the Boston skyline. The demands of war drove radar research at a fantastic pace, compressing decades of basic advances into just 5 years. At the RadLab, physicists knew that only constant innovation would keep them ahead of their Axis counterparts.
I was asked to head a new group which was called the Advanced Development Group. And that group had the assignment of, we used jokingly to say, fighting World War III. Namely, we were working on future things. Actually, it turned out the things that we worked on were very much applied during World War II.
All that would change on December 7th, 1941. At 7:00 a.m., radar sites at Pearl Harbor detected a massive incoming airborne force. The information was passed up the chain of command, where it was promptly ignored. This strange new gadget called radar, it was decided, must be malfunctioning. At dawn, the Japanese struck.
Ignoring warnings is a common theme, isn't it? As you watch this episode, which originally aired in 1997, I would invite you to consider current events and to ask yourself what should happen when a warning is received.
May 1940. Germany crushes French forces, conquering the country in a matter of weeks. Hitler rides triumphantly into Paris. Just miles away, 20-year-old Pat Hancock finds his Royal Air Force squadron squarely in the teeth of the Nazi advance.
Germans were advancing madly, and from then on we literally retreated, if not every day, every 2 or 3 days. They had already, of course, swept through Norway before that. Then they occupied Belgium and then Denmark, and they were having a great old time.
Hitler is on the verge of completing his lightning conquest of Europe. Only Britain, a tiny island surrounded by the Nazi blitzkrieg, stands in his way. Defying the grim odds, the British refuse to surrender.
England was under severe air attack, and of course the purpose of this attack was to knock out the Royal Air Force as a prelude to a cross-channel assault on England itself. And Hitler knew that he had the military strength to move across the channel, but he dared not venture it against the Royal Navy unless he could establish air superiority.
Few doubted that England would soon fall. The German Luftwaffe fleet numbered 2,400 planes, 4 times that of the RAF. And once Hitler captured England, his hold on the continent would be secured. Even the United States might be unable to challenge his domination. The fate of freedom in Europe and around the world hung in the balance. The one hope for British survival was the new and top-secret technology of radar. radar was more discovered than invented. By the 1930s, radio waves were everywhere, conveying entertainment and information to millions. In the course of transmission, radio technicians noticed that large objects reflected their signals. The phenomenon was dubbed radar, for radio detecting and ranging. The word radar is spelled the same forward or backward, a clever play on the process it describes.
When the radar antenna sends out its pulses, they bounce back from the unknown target, and the result is seen as a peak on the radar screen. Reading this pattern, the distance and speed of an approaching plane are charted.
Germany and the United States saw radar as one of many technologies worth pursuing. But British leaders faced with Hitler's threats gave air defense top priority. Their radar pioneers worked out of this remote Gothic mansion 90 miles from London. They developed a national radar system, the Chain Home Network. By 1940, the eastern coastline of England was ringed with 21 radar towers. These electronic sentries provided early warning of enemy attacks from up to 100 miles away. Hitler and his generals had carefully built the most awesome fighting machine ever, but they were unprepared for this new technology.
Radar was entirely unanticipated, and when the strategists of air power developed their ideas in the 1920s and 1930s, what they imagined was free access to attack on the enemy's homeland, and radar denied them that.
Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe, suspected that the huge towers bordering England were a radar network. A German Zeppelin was dispatched over England to search for radio waves. It detected none, possibly because of scanning the wrong wavelengths. The Chain Home radar reached across the English Channel, detecting unsuspecting enemy aircraft as they massed in attack formations over French airfields. Data on the location and speed of the Luftwaffe squadrons went to underground operation centers. There, giant maps of the coastline were marked to reflect the latest intelligence. Generals relayed their orders to 4 RAF command centers where fighter planes were scrambled to intercept.
At this stage, we simply know that we were to go. We leapt into our airplanes with the ground crew strapping us in at high speed, and off we went, following the leader. Grass fields, remember, no runway. We simply took up 12 abreast, even 24 abreast sometimes.
In World War I, airborne planes were on their own, but now RAF ground centers maintained control over their squadrons using radar to direct them on intercept courses. Only when enemy planes were spotted would command pass to the pilots, who uttered their rallying cry of "Tally ho!" The battle was on. Radar's early warning allowed the RAF to conserve its limited resources of planes, fuel, and pilots. And by surprising the enemy at the right place with the right number of aircraft, the RAF downed 2 Luftwaffe planes for every one lost. As the Battle of Britain stretched over the summer of 1940, radar denied Hitler the air superiority he needed to launch an invasion. For the first time, the Nazi blitzkrieg had been slowed, and proof that Germany was vulnerable gave English civilians the courage to withstand the constant bombardment of their homes. During the battle, American physicist George Valley saw firsthand the resolve of ordinary Londoners to outlast Hitler.
They built up the fronts of the houses, but behind the fronts of the houses was nothing. And so you could see what looked like a pretty complete city, and it was actually blown to hell. You can keep a stiff upper lip a hell of a lot better if you aren't looking at ruins every day. They fixed it to keep the morale of the Londoners high, and the morale was high.
Radar had kept Britain alive, but time was running out. Even at a kill ratio of 2-to-1, the RAF would soon succumb to the far greater resources of the Luftwaffe.
The British were being slowly drained of important resources in planes and, even more importantly, in pilots. This was the best and brightest. You could not bring a young man up to training so fast, and these constant day after day attacks on the British airfields were taking their toll.
For Hitler, complete victory was in sight, but his ignorance of radar would sabotage his dreams of conquest. He would commit a tactical blunder that rescued Britain and paved the way for 5 more years of radar warfare. In 1939, British dispatchers misread the new radar system and sent up squadrons of planes to fight non-existent German planes. In the confusion, several RAF planes were shot down. In August 1940, Churchill ordered the first aerial attacks on German territory. Although the strikes caused little damage in Berlin, they enraged Hitler. Already furious at the British for resisting, he poured his anger into massive attacks on London.
Instead of concentrating on knocking out the radar and knocking out the airfields and knocking out the planes, they finally turned towards retaliatory raids against London and the civilian population, and that was a waste of their strategic air power. If they had not made that mistake, it's not clear that the Royal Air Force could have prevailed in that battle.
The summer-long struggle culminated in an epic air battle on September 15, 1940. By late in the day, the Luftwaffe had lost 60 aircraft, the RAF 26. Unknown to Germany, Britain had exhausted its reserves of fighter planes. England was defenseless. Of this day, Churchill later wrote, "The odds were great, our margins small, the stakes infinite." Germany, busy counting its own losses, finally decided to break off the attack. 2 days later, Hitler canceled his invasion plans. Guarded by newfound technology and old-fashioned human tenacity, Britain had survived its darkest hour.
Without radar, we would have been as we were in World War I, basically depending entirely on our eyeballs. Radar was a fantastic development. It was one of the major reasons for winning the battle, apart from the fact that we did.
Even as the Battle of Britain raged, English scientists turned their thoughts to long-term survival. Faced with few options, they decided to share their most vital military secrets with the United States. Only America possessed the scientific and industrial capacity to support a long war. Radar pioneer Taffy Bowen collected his country's scientific bounty in a single black box.
He actually carried it on the underground to the British Ministry of Supply and then picked it up again in a cab and took it to his hotel. The box was too big to fit in the safe deposit at the hotel, so he had to sleep with Britain's most precious secrets wedged under his bed.
Of all the blueprints, diagrams, and devices in Bowen's trunk, none mattered more than a small radio transmitter called the cavity magnetron. Existing radars transmitted at low frequencies or long wavelengths, with each radio wave measuring 1 to 10 meters. The cavity magnetron could generate shorter or microwaves only 10 centimeters long. Microwaves produced a narrower beam, much more accurate at pinpointing a target's location. And while previous systems required large transmitters, microwaves offered the promise of sophisticated radars compact enough to fit on a plane. The prospect of airborne radar took on added urgency when Hitler switched to night raids on English cities. Thousands took to sleeping in the underground. On a single October night, London was pounded for 9 straight hours, leaving hundreds dead. Aboard the Canadian liner Duchess of Richmond, Taffy Bowen carried the precious cavity magnetron to the United States. America's first radar research center was hastily established on the MIT campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and named the Radiation Laboratory, or RadLab.
The nation's top physicists were recruited in secret to this radar project more than a year before the United States even entered the war. Among them were 10 future Nobel laureates, several university presidents, 2 science advisors to presidents. The best of the best were corralled into the secret project, often with nothing more than someone they knew telling them to come to Boston to do secret war work.
One of the first recruits was Norman Ramsey, a young physicist and future Nobel Prize winner. He was summoned to MIT for a temporary stay that would last more than half a century.
It was a very exciting time. The war was, in one sense, had been very depressing, and at least we were doing something actively about it. It was apparent that radar was a very major component.
American scientists were new to war work and untutored in the ways of secrecy. Concerned, Dr. Ramsey tested the lab's security by having his wife phone and request technical information.
At that time, there was no distinction between internal calls and external calls at the lab. You could call on external telephone and begin asking questions, and you got very good answers. It soon became more and more revealing, and with each bit of information you figured out was radio location we were working on. It was figured out it was 10 centimeter wavelength. She got a tremendous amount of information just by telephone.
The Nazis apparently never took advantage of the lax security. But by late 1940, they had belatedly realized radar's importance and geared up their best scientific minds in a race to match Allied technology. But an unprecedented series of partnerships would keep the RadLab a step ahead. Physicists accustomed to working alone joined in teams to develop ideas. Scientific and military leaders who had clashed in World War I cooperated freely. And perhaps most importantly, American physicists delighted in collaborating with their English cousins.
Taffy Bowen came to America, and he came to be the living embodiment of the spirit of the RadLab. Here was this British scientist, the same age as all the Americans, yet he'd already worked for 5 years to protect his country from invasion.
The RadLab expanded with astonishing speed. By war's end, it had over 4,000 workers. Building after building was turned over to the lab. And strange domes appeared on MIT rooftops. Inside the mysterious structures, experimental radars showed their stuff by bouncing test signals off the Boston skyline.
During that period of time, the MIT Humor magazine came out with a cartoon showing the side of MIT with a most fantastic array of structures up on top, which was sort of ridiculing the amount that we had put up there, and this was a very conspicuous thing.
Despite this effort, adopting microwave radar for airborne intercept took time. In Britain, the Luftwaffe's reign of terror continued unabated into the spring of 1941. Frustrated in his latest attempt to crush British resolve, in June 1941, Hitler launched a surprise invasion of Russia. At the RadLab, scientists turned their attention to developing air-to-ground radar for hunting ships and submarines. Soon, no vessel would escape radar's long reach, not even Germany's most feared warship, the mighty Bismarck. Radar units were installed in some British planes as early as 1939, but were removed before they flew missions over Europe to prevent radar technology from falling into German hands. Having failed to bomb the British into surrender, Germany was determined to starve them into submission. As an island nation, England was utterly dependent on outside supplies. Great convoys tried to deliver desperately needed food and fuel, but the Nazi warship Bismarck terrorized Allied shipping in the North Atlantic. It sank Britain's most powerful ship, the Hood, in a matter of minutes. When a magazine exploded aboard the Hood, only 3 survived out of a crew of 1,400 men. Stunned by the loss of their flagship, English morale plummeted. The Bismarck seemed invincible, but the Allies struck back, employing their superior radar to hunt the now legendary ship. After sinking a supply vessel on May 26, 1941, the Bismarck disappeared into a veil of fog and clouds. A cat-and-mouse chase ensued as the British carrier Ark Royal used its radar to lead a large force in pursuit. For 30 hours, Allied radar tracked the Bismarck on a zigzag course across the North Atlantic. When the weather finally cleared, a massive 24-hour assault destroyed the Bismarck. The radar war was in full swing.
The sides were literally racing with each other for the newest innovations and also the newest countermeasures against the enemy's innovations, and finally countermeasures, until whole scientific teams were devoted to anticipating what the enemy was likely to do with new technology and trying to protect themselves against the consequences. It was a real hothouse atmosphere.
With the United States still officially at peace, its naval officers were slow to realize radar's importance. All that would change on December 7th, 1941. At 7:00 a.m., radar sites at Pearl Harbor detected a massive incoming airborne force. The information was passed up the chain of command, where it was promptly ignored. This strange new gadget called radar, it was decided, must be malfunctioning. At dawn, the Japanese struck. The surprise assault on Pearl Harbor left over 2,400 dead, 300 planes destroyed, and the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet in chaos. Never again would radar's early warning power be ignored.
The Pearl Harbor attack, for all the tremendous tragedy it brought, did more to ensure radar's place in World War II than anything else. Once it became known that a radar station had actually spotted the beginnings of the Japanese attack and followed it all the way into Oahu, the Army and Navy immediately launched these massive programs to assess the state of their radar development.
The war had become truly global. Allied leaders agreed that their top priority was maintaining supply lines to England. If Hitler starved England into submission, there would be no base from which to liberate Europe. Even the United States might be forced to make a negotiated peace with the Nazis.
Will win through to absolute victory.
Right after the U.S. entered the war formally in December 1941, the German Admiral Dönitz launched Operation Paukenschlag, the roll of the drum, in which he began, through his U-boats, attacking the shipping along the east coast of North America and the United States. And this, from the start, totally devastated shipping. The United States was completely ineffective. It had no grand plan to protect the ships. There were no convoys. There were something like 9 aircraft able to go out and patrol. The Navy sent its first destroyer out, and it was promptly sunk.
submarines were really pretty bad things. You could sit out on the corner at Cape Cod and watch a submarine every day. They come up and knock some damn tramp steamer off. It was just a standard show.
By early 1943, Allied losses in the North Atlantic had reached catastrophic proportions. In March, 21 supply vessels were sunk at the cost of a lone U-boat. Thanks to Operation Packenschlag, Germany was dangerously close to winning the war. Building on microwave technology, the RadLab developed air-to-ground radar precise enough to detect U-boats and compact enough to squeeze into aircraft.
Fitting radars into the airplanes that were already built was a real problem, but we had one great advantage in the case of the Navy planes. The larger airplanes had both officer's head and an enlisted man's head. That is, separate toilets for the officers and the enlisted men. And we usually appropriated one or another of these heads and forced them to use a common one.
The U-boat's primary defense was their presumed invisibility. Once airborne radar stripped away their veil, the subs were easy prey.
Radar gave them the option to move against the submarine offensively, that is, to seek out the submarine and to find it even when it wasn't moving in on a convoy vessel. These submarines had to spend a considerable amount of time on the surface recharging their batteries. They needed the oxygen to do that. And when they were on the surface, night or day, they were vulnerable to detection by radar.
Within a few short months in the summer of 1943, the Germans saw victory slip from their grasp. The battle in the North Atlantic turned against them, and with it went their chance for global supremacy. U-boat losses grew steadily, freeing the lifeline to Britain. On May 15, 1943, Admiral Donitz broadcast a plaintive message to his forces at sea.
The enemy, in his efforts to deprive the U-boat of its invisibility, has developed a system of radio location which puts him several lengths ahead of us. I am fully aware of all the difficulties you encounter in fighting the convoy defense forces. As your commander-in-chief, I have done and will continue to do everything to change this situation as soon as possible.
German scientists did their best to fight back. They equipped their subs with a device called metox that sounded when radio waves reflected off the hull, signaling the ship to dive to safety. But the RadLab quickly bested this countermeasure with a countermeasure. Radars that transmitted wavelengths too short to be read by metox. Having twice survived death blows from the Third Reich, England and its allies were ready to take the offensive. Liberating Europe would require the largest and most complicated military operation in history. The radar war would reach its zenith as scientists on both sides raced to develop the next and decisive generation of technology. The radar scope in airplanes can detect storm clouds up to 150 miles away. This is why the fasten seatbelt sign is often turned on several minutes before the turbulence hits. The demands of war drove radar research at a fantastic pace, compressing decades of basic advances into just 5 years. At the RadLab, physicists knew that only constant innovation would keep them ahead of their Axis counterparts.
I was asked to head a new group which was called the Advanced Development Group. And that group had the assignment of, we used jokingly to say, fighting World War III. Namely, we were working on future things. Actually, it turned out the things that we worked on were very much applied during World War II.
One of the toughest challenges was directing planes to targets thousands of miles distant. In 1943, the Allies began massive airstrikes inside Germany. But the skies there were cloudy 3 out of 5 days, blinding the bombers. Dr. George Valley experimented with converting anti-sub radars into directional beacons. His new system, the H-2X, quickly became a hot property.
And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there arrived Colonel Cowart and another colonel, and they said, "How soon can you equip 12 B-17s?" And I said, "Huh?" And they said, "How soon, doctor, can you equip 12 B-17s?" Well, I had one set.
The H-2X, though only accurate to within a few hundred yards, got the job done. It allowed bombing through clouds and darkness, peeling away Germany's natural defenses. The H-2X was installed in a select group of American-made B-17s that acted as aerial pathfinders. One radar-equipped craft would lead up to 750 B-17s on bombing raids. When the leader dropped his bombs, the rest followed suit, leaving a swath of destruction larger than a square mile. Now, able to fly under all conditions, Allied planes doubled their sorties, ravaging Germany. Just as the war created and unleashed weapons unthinkable when it began, it revolutionized the concept of acceptable military tactics. The advent of area bombing led directly to the intentional destruction of civilian populations, a policy which the Allies had insisted they would never sink to.
And that's when we started to get the targeting of cities in Germany and later in Japan. In the case of the British, they actually pursued a policy that they called de-housing. By this, they meant that they would use strategic bombing to eliminate the housing of the industrial workers, and by dislocating the workers, they would interfere with the industrial productivity and therefore the war-fighting capability of the German state. But of course, this was all a euphemism for attacking civilians.
Germany attempted to use its radar against the invading planes with little success. Starting in 1943, to counter ground-to-air radar, Allied aircraft dropped bundles of aluminum strips known as chaff.
When these were dropped in front of a radar image, they tended to scatter the image and send back a false image. And so attacking aircraft would use these as a countermeasure against enemy's defensive radar, and it was enormously effective. And in fact, a large part of the German countryside ended up being covered with aluminum foil by the time the war ended.
In the field of radar, they have the geniuses and we have the nincompoops. I hate the rogues like the plague, but in one respect I am obliged to doff my cap to them. After the war's over, I'm going to buy myself a British radio set as a token of my regard for their high-frequency work. Reich Chancellor Hermann Göring.
By pounding German cities relentlessly, American bombers drew the Luftwaffe into the skies in self-defense. This led to the total destruction of German air power, paving the way for the liberation of the continent.
D-Day invasion was met by 0 Luftwaffe airplanes. Had there been thousands of Luftwaffe airplanes on D-Day, there would have been strafing, and our soldiers would have only been able to land with armor plate over their heads, and that would have really slowed down the proposition and maybe caused it to fail.
The D-Day invasion of France became the culmination of an elaborate electronic chess match. During the Battle of Britain, defensive radar had allowed England to husband its limited resources. Now, ironically, Germany was in the same position, hoping that radar would protect its frontiers against a vastly more powerful foe. The Nazis' only chance to repel the assault was to concentrate their defenses. Hitler and his generals would have to guess where the invasion force would land. Tired of losing the radar war, Germany had assembled 600 radars at 200 sites along the coast from Denmark to Spain. Courageous Allied airmen embarked on a series of low-altitude, high-risk missions to bomb the radars. All but a few were destroyed, and those still operational were intentionally left intact to see what the Allies wanted them to see. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, 1,200 combat vessels and 4,000 landing craft converged on the beaches of Normandy. Meanwhile, two phantom invasion forces headed north of the Seine River. Codenamed Glimmer and Taxable, these small groups of ships carried a series of 9-foot radar-reflecting dishes, each dish mimicking the echo of a 10,000-ton ship. Above the phony fleets, planes dropped barrels of chaff as if supporting an actual invasion. They flew in giant rectangular patterns 4 by 16 miles and proceeded east at 8 knots, the size and speed of a giant seaborne force. The deception worked. Glimmer caused a full-scale alert in Dunkirk, freezing German troops there. By the time the actual invasion force landed at Normandy, the Nazis were so confused, they thought this too was another decoy. Not until the afternoon of the 6th did they commit their full defenses to Normandy. By then it was too late. Before nightfall, 150,000 Allied troops had landed and secured the beachheads.
Either on the high seas, in land battles, in the bombing campaign, time and time again against a highly effective and resourceful enemy, it was radar that provided the critical margin of victory.
Within a year of D-Day, Hitler would be dead, his vaunted Third Reich in ruins. In Boston, the men and women who had done so much to defeat him faced the end of the RadLab with mixed emotions. By war's end, the RadLab had designed 120 different radar systems. American industry had churned out over 1 million sets. With the dropping of the first atomic bomb, public attention turned to Los Alamos, denying the radar wizards their just due. But insiders knew well the truth of a favorite RadLab saying: the atomic bomb ended the war. Radar won it. As radar units get smaller, their usefulness increases. Miniature radar units can now be installed in soldiers' helmets to detect enemy movement, and tiny radar systems are being used in canes for the blind. Even in the darkest days of World War II, Americans never faced the threat of attacks on their homes and families. In 1949, that sense of security would vanish forever. In August 1949, American sensors detected unusual amounts of radioactive dust in the atmosphere. An analysis confirmed the unthinkable. Russia had exploded its first nuclear device. For many in the free world, the thought of Stalin with the bomb posed an even more terrifying threat than Hitler had.
And this struck everybody with a blow in the chest. Nobody believed the Russians were smart enough to learn how to make strike anywhere matches, much less atom bombs.
The Atlantic and Pacific no longer shielded America from foreign attack. Other international upheavals quickly followed. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The following year, the United States and Russia faced off through their client states in South and North Korea. In December 1950, President Truman responded to Chinese involvement in the war by declaring a national emergency.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war.
All of a sudden, with the bomb in Stalin's hands, America was a vulnerable island, just as Britain had been back in 1940 facing Hitler's war machine. This propelled the radar veterans from World War II back into the fore in this furious drive to create a new warning network for the United States.
In the days before satellites, radar offered the only hope of early detection of enemy bombs. Called SAGE, for Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, the new defense network sought to link massive amounts of information from radar arrays spanning the continent. SAGE depended on digital computers doing real-time calculations, allowing information to be collected, collated, analyzed, and presented at command headquarters in a matter of seconds.
SAGE was a multi-billion-dollar research and development effort to create the first truly national-scale, networked, computerized information gathering and manipulation system. In many ways, it is the first model for the internet. It was a remarkable achievement.
Just as in World War II, the ever-changing dynamics of the Cold War propelled radar to ever greater heights of sophistication. When the Russian launched Sputnik ushered in the satellite age in 1957, radars began examining satellites for their military potential, a process that continues to this day.
Modern radars have become pretty good at looking at an unknown satellite and determining its shape and its function. The details of how this is done are classified, but it's fair to say that we can produce an image of that satellite. And for example, if you had a Volkswagen or a Toyota in orbit, our modern radar technology could probably tell us which was which.
Beginning in the 1960s, intercontinental ballistic missiles offered radar a new challenge. An ICBM may carry many warheads, each one either a decoy or a live nuclear weapon.
It costs an enormous amount of money to throw a 1,000 or 1,500 pound warhead intercontinental distances. The enemy tries to put all his money into the warheads and not much into the other stuff. And what we try and do is figure out what are the heavy bodies from the light bodies. So the problem simply boils down to reaching out 500 miles, tickling a body with an electromagnetic beam and trying to tell how much it weighs.
Radar has come a long way in the last 60 years, from accidental echoes off passing ships to reflecting the wake of an earthbound ballistic missile. 60 years as a pivotal tool in the timeless battle between freedom and tyranny. These cement foundations are all that remain today of the English chain home network. They stand in mute tribute to the invention that won the Battle of Britain and rescued mankind from the abyss.
The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization.
But for radar's distant echoes, Hitler might well have broken England. And with the loss of freedom's last outpost in Europe, history's tale could have been very different.
Without radar, it would have made it very much more difficult to win the Battle of Britain. It was difficult enough. If that battle had been lost, my guess is that life would have been extremely unpleasant for those who lived in Great Britain. And we would never, ever have invaded the continent again because it was difficult enough invading it from this country. And had America come into the war to mount an invasion from America, no way. If that air war had been lost and the Germans had come here and had been successful, lots of ifs, but if it had happened, then, well, I wouldn't be here and you would be speaking German.
Und der Führer,